Good morning, hello, and welcome to Wednesday's Politics at Jack and Sam's Daily, the podcast that seeks to tell you, first thing every day, absolutely everything that's coming up in the hours ahead in British politics in under 20 minutes.
My name is Jack Blanchard of Politico. With me back in his kitchen is Sam Coates of Sky News. It is Wednesday, September the 18th, and we are in that lull period between party conferences, which means Sam Coates looks a little bit more rested than he did yesterday when he appeared to have been struggling under the weight of a party conference. Sam, is that fair?
I went to bed at 9:30 last night, so all is well with the world. But while I was making my way back from a extremely upbeat, almost nauseatingly so, Liberal Democrat conference where they were all shouting really disobliging things about their political opponents by the end of Monday night. You have been out and about in Westminster. You've been keeping your ears to the ground. What have you been up to?
Well, I mean, keeping my ears to the ground is a bit generous. I've been drinking wine at a book launch, but that was fun. Anushka Astana of ITV News, who mentioned this yesterday, your former colleague from formerly of Sky some time ago, has written a book about I thought it was just about the election. It's called Taken as Read, and it's really about how Labour came back to power. She was speaking on stage last night with Pippa Carrera of The Guardian and really talking through some of the insights she's discovered in researching her book about Labour's return to power and the sort of long march from Corbynism to a landslide victory. There was this glorious moment, Sam, which you really would have appreciated, where Anushka was talking through how this sort of Corbyn think tank project called Labour Together, which listeners may be aware of, which was sort of set up during the Corbyn years to try and succeed Corbynism with a sort of soft left Labour that might come back to power, was happening in the background. And she was talking about how Labour Together, these key figures, were all plotting to put Keir Starmer in power and replaced Jeremy Corbyn. While she was talking through in detail how this was done, one of Labour Together's key figures, Steve Reid, is stood there in the room listening, 5-10 yards away from Seamus Milne, Jeremy Corbyn's head of strategy and comms, both standing there, stony faced, looking very serious, listening to how one of them had completely plotted to bring down the other with enormous success. And yeah, it was just a lovely moment to be stood there watching this. It really was the two halves of the Labour family brought together over a glass of wine to pick over the bones of history.
Well, of course, that unity is not completely unheard of in the Labour Party. There is a very senior figure in this Downing Street, Keir Starmer's Downing Street, who is marrying a member of Corbyn's inner team. So there is a little bit of harmony in the Labour Party between the two factions these days. Anyway, what three things are we focusing on today, Jack?
The story that is on every single front page is this extraordinary story in the Middle East about the exploding pagers, which have devastated members of Hezbollah right across Lebanon. Pretty much every newspaper splashed that today. We're going to be talking about where Britain is on this and where we are in terms of global diplomacy on the back of one of the most extraordinary events I can remember in the Middle East. Yesterday, leading all the news bulletins, leading all the newspapers. So we'll have to talk about that. We'll talk about what the government wants to talk about today. There's a few things on their agenda. One is inflation stats, which should be out in about the next 10 minutes. We're having this conversation about 10 to 7, so we'll bring you those stats when they drop. And what that means for the budget and for interest rates. And it's a big day in NHS land because Wes Streeting is going to be speaking at the launch of a new report today, the Health Secretary, alongside Lord Darzai, who wrote that big report last week on NHS reform. And we should talk a bit about Scotland because happy birthday, Indie Ref. The independence referendum in Scotland was 10 years ago today. I remember it like it was yesterday. So we'll talk a little bit about that as well, what we remember about that day and where Scotland is at now, 10 years on.
That's right. And if you have any questions for us, we would be delighted to answer them. Just WhatsApp us a voice note, 07511 867 633, 07511 867 633. Send us a voice note, send us a message, let us know what you think of what you want to know.
I bumped into one very prominent Brexiteer on my way back from the book launch last night who stopped me outside Westminster Cathedral and threatened to send us a voice note about Brexit, Sam, so that may be coming your way, so brace yourself. Anyway, let's talk about this incredible incident in Lebanon yesterday. Well, it wasn't really one incident, was it? It was a coordinated attack on thousands of people, these pages that blew up simultaneously or pretty much simultaneously think right across the country. Pages used by the militant group Hezbollah. Lots of people died, many more people injured, some of them very, very seriously injured. I don't think I can remember reading anything like this happening before. Sam, what do you make of it, and where is Britain on this when something like this happens?
I mean, this audacious synchronized attack appears to have taken place after the pages were modified, what's being described as at a production level, so kind of at some point in the making process. And this follows a warning from the head of Hezbollah to his followers, to his supporters, to ditch mobile phones and move to pages because it would stop hostile forces, largely Israel, from being able to track and target members of the terrorist group. And that is the context for what we're seeing today. I think it's fair to say that the Foreign Office, Downing Street, the global diplomatic community is back extremely nervous about what happens next, because escalation and the conflict in the Middle East properly spreading to Iran-backed Hezbollah in Lebanon and across Iran's other proxies is something that is massively worried our government and other governments over recent months. Just to give you some context of just how seriously Britain is monitoring what goes on in Lebanon, I think David Lammy made 3 trips over the summer to the region and engaged and reached out specifically to the Lebanese government, was sending messages to Hezbollah. He's told the House of Commons that in order to try and de-escalate. And Britain has also made it clear to Israel to do what it can to de-escalate as well. And the fear is, given that we are getting reports from Lebanon, that the Lebanese government is blaming Israel, we are getting some reports out of American media that some American officials are pointing the finger at Israel as well. The question is, if Hezbollah and other Middle East forces decide that this is an attack by Israel on people across Lebanon and into Syria, what the next move is by them, and could this actually tip everything into something much more grim in the coming weeks and months. That's why a spokesman for the Foreign Office has issued a appeal for calm heads and to de-escalate at this critical time. I would expect those words to be repeated by ministers as the day goes on. But it's as David Lammy flies off on another diplomatic visit today, I think it's no underestimation to say this is the biggest focus for the Foreign Office right now, because the consequences of escalation in Lebanon and all-out war in the region has ticked up this morning.
I think that's a really, really important point, and I think if Parliament were sitting today, you could well imagine there being some sort of urgent question or statement in the Commons this afternoon. Parliament, of course, is in recess for this period, so that won't happen. I remember, Sam, we launched this podcast at the start of October last year. We're just coming up to a year's anniversary, can you believe? And the October 7th attacks, of course, were just after that. And I remember us saying that very first day after it happened, that the one thing that everyone in the FCO, in the British Foreign Office, worried about was this turning into a regional war, some sort of escalation. Could this thing be contained? They obviously knew Israel were going to react following what happened, but could this be contained as an essentially Israeli-Gazan conflict? Things like this yesterday are the things they've always been worried about, and it's pretty obvious that fingers are going to be pointed at Israel given the incredibly sophisticated nature of what happened, and therefore you have to worry about a reaction, and you have to worry about where that then goes.
I think Britain will be talking to America quite a lot today, because I was reading the Washington Post this morning, and they reported that this week top Israeli officials met with senior White House advisors and said that, and basically the Israeli officials said that military action against Hezbollah would be needed in order to allow tens of thousands of residents to get back to their homes along Israel's northern border. And that was taken by the White House as a sign that Israel was shifting its focus from the war against Hamas in Gaza to Lebanon. So that's the context this week. And I suspect one of the reasons why people are pointing at Israel. Israel's not commenting. The Israeli army isn't commenting, we should say. Hezbollah, for its side, has said that it will halt attacks against Israel if a ceasefire is reached in Gaza, but that still looks like a long way away. Now, David Lammy is flying today to Norway to speak to Oslo counterparts. Now, that in itself is quite interesting. That's predominantly a meeting about Russia, because Norway much closer to the front line of Russia and plays a bigger role in Ukraine. But Norway is interesting in this context as well, because Norway has taken a much tougher stance against Israel all the way through this entire conflict. They have called out Israel's use of military force as disproportionate, saying it's got a disproportionately severe impact on the civilian population, and that they have their actions have not been in line with international humanitarian law. So expect effectively David Lammy to be presented with quite a tougher diplomatic position when he sees his foreign minister counterpart. Norway also has recognised Palestinian statehood, a decision that the UK government has signalled it could take but hasn't yet taken. Oslo, of course, the home of the ultimately failed Oslo peace accords in the 1990s. Those agreements negotiated by Bill Clinton to try and bring peace to the Middle East. Yasser Arafat and others that didn't succeed, and ultimately laid the path to some of what we're seeing today.
And it's interesting just how much of the diplomacy that Keir Starmer and David Lammy have been doing in their 2 months in office, Sam, has been defence focused, isn't it? You know, it's really telling sign of the times. So many of these trips, we had the whole thing last week about the missile diplomacy in the White House. We've been talking about it. Starmer was talking about it with Giorgia Meloni. On Monday, David Lammy in Norway talking about Russia and, as you say, about Gaza as well. So much of Keir Starmer's so-called reset of relations with the EU and attempts to sort of bind Britain more closely to the EU again after Brexit has a defence focus. We've talked about a new defence pact with Germany. We've got a story today in Politico by my colleague Esther Weber about them plans for a new defence pact, or at least a refreshed defence pact with France, and wanting much closer military ties with France in the coming months, refreshing David Cameron's Lancaster House Agreement from 2010, if you can remember back that far. You probably can, Sam, with us being so old. But so much of this has a defence focus. This wasn't the case through much of the 2010s, but everything is being seen through the frame now of either Russian military threat, or trouble in the Middle East, or indeed Chinese long-term military threat as well. It feels like it's taking up an awful lot of headspace in Downing Street, which you wouldn't necessarily have expected for a new prime minister coming in, after 14 years out of power, big domestic agenda to get on with, and yet foreign affairs just constantly going straight to the top of the agenda.
Let's pivot quickly to those domestic affairs, because there's awful lot of stuff the government is doing today and is happening today. The main thing on the agenda is a meeting with Angela Rayner, Deputy Prime Minister, and Johnny Reynolds, who's the Business Secretary, with representatives of the trade unions and the CBI and other business groups, just to talk about that workers' rights package that's going to materialise after party conference at some point in the first half of October. So we might get some indication of where some of those issues have landed. A lot of the stories around today are connected with the economy, the budget on October the 30th, and just where we're heading in that kind of tussle between growth and spending cuts. It's not quite 7 o'clock, so we haven't yet got the inflation figures, which are expected to remain above the 2% target, which is probably going to mean that tomorrow we don't get another cut on interest rates after the Bank of England cut last time from 5.25 to 5%. But the debate in government, which is going to go up a gear this week, is on what to do in the budget. It's going to go up a gear this week because tomorrow I think the government gets its first private forecast from the Office for Budget Responsibility about what the outlook is for the economy, and hence how much money Rachel Reeves does and doesn't have to spend. So a deep breath moment for those inside the Treasury. Just at the point as we're starting to get sort of public campaigning about what people want to see and don't want to see. So there is concern that there might be cuts to effectively climate change programs. You've got David Lammy being just slightly more slightly more circumspect about whether or not the almost £10 billion of climate finance is going to survive the sort of budget spending review process. More circumspect certainly than Ed Miliband was. You've got charities out and about calling on the government to roll over the couple of billion quid that the Tories gave the international aid budget. The international aid budget, of course, raided for domestic support for things like asylum seekers. So that's all over the place, worrying that that's going to hit Britain's soft power. All of this comes because the Mail has got a story that reflects something we talked about in the last couple of weeks, which is the Treasury is telling everybody, the Treasury machine is telling ministers, we don't really want tax rises to fill the £22 billion black hole. We want spending cuts. It's a much better way to fill it. It means we get the money that we need now rather than at some point in the future. Spending cuts, capital project cuts, which is effectively growth project cuts. That's what they're all looking out for. That's what the Treasury want. The problem is, does it hit growth? It's one of the great big tensions inside government at the moment, filling the black hole versus spending on projects that are going to result in growth. And that's the thing that we're all got to wait and see to see how Rachel Reeves resolves.
Yeah, Wes Streeting, the health secretary, who's making that speech today at the IPPR think tank alongside Ara Darzai and talking about health reform. He's given an interview to the New Statesman this morning where he hints that there is more bad things to come. He says in the interview, I can understand why there'll be some pensioners. He's talking about the winter fuel allowance cut, of course. I can understand why there'll be some pensioners sat there thinking, why us? What about the others? Well, there are other choices to come. Watch out, everyone else who's not a pensioner, because you're about to get clobbered as well. And whether Labour can land that without becoming even more unpopular, as their rather dire poll ratings suggest they already are pretty unpopular, remains to be seen. But it, as you say, it's the main thing that people inside government are talking about. Everything is linked to that. This health reform package is ultimately linked to that. Like the big sort of change that Wes Streeting wants to bring about within the NHS, yes, requires, in his view, a shake-up of how the NHS is organised, a shift in care towards social care and towards preventative medicine. But ultimately, it still costs money, Sam. Like it's not. No one really thinks this is a problem that you can solve without throwing some money at it. And where on earth things like those sorts of investments are going to come from in a world where, as you say, the Treasury is all talking about cuts, is the really difficult thing that Labour somehow needs to square.
Wes Streeting has come up with the best soundbite of this government, I think, which is that Britain could at best end up as a country with an NHS attached. I really do think that he has a way of articulating some of the country's challenges much better than some of his colleagues. He does stand out, I think, as a communicator, head and shoulders above others, including sometimes Keir Starmer, who can be a bit woolly. Anyway, that won't have helped him. Scotland, what anniversary is it and why do we care?
Happy birthday, the independence referendum. Gosh, I remember it so well. 10 years ago today. I can always remember my life as a political journalist, Sam, changing in one moment. And it was when that famous YouGov poll dropped a few weeks before the independence referendum, which suddenly showed that the yes camp, the people that wanted to leave the United Kingdom, were in front, and all of Westminster went into a complete meltdown. I got shipped up to Scotland the next day by my editor and installed in a hotel. I was like, quick, write about this story, Scotland's about to leave. And there was this whole drama all through the autumn of 2014. Of course, Scotland voted to stay, but it changed the dynamic of British politics completely for the next decade. The surge in support for the SNP afterwards and all the rest of it. And it feels like, everything that came from that at the 2015 election results and the rise of Jeremy Corbyn and everything can in a way be linked back to with the Indie referendum.
I was the person for the Times at the time doing the YouGov polling, and I remember basically being locked in a hotel room, banned from talking to anybody as it approached 10 o'clock and we were going to release the results of the poll at that point we were doing jointly with The Sun. We put it online, we released it on social media. And the bloke from The Sun, who I won't name, tweeted it at 9:59 just to annoy everybody. So that's an enduring memory. But you're right, that was the moment where it was clear that politicians were willing to take the biggest risks with the future of our country. And it felt that from 2014 to 2024, to the last election, the whole of that decade has felt very wobbly and very uncertain. Today, I have to say, the polls suggest that public haven't much changed their view since that referendum. If you look at the opinion polls, 56% say they would vote no still, 44% say they would vote for Scotland to leave. So in all that time, nothing has changed, apart from everything has changed.
We are pretty much out of time. Just to say that inflation also has not changed, stayed at 2.2% as it did the previous month, which probably means interest rates aren't going to get cut tomorrow. We better leave it there. We will talk more about interest rates in the morning. Nice to see you, Sam.
I see you there. See you tomorrow.